Hello everyone and welcome to a webinar from Edureka on React interview questions. In this particular webinar, I'll talk about the interview questions which could be asked or might be asked when you will face an interview for React.js. So let's get started. So first of all, what is the reach of React in market nowadays? If I talk about React reach in market, it's a very popular library and very famous nowadays among the developers community. So if I talk about React is front-end JavaScript library which was developed by Facebook in 2013. It is an open source library and follows the component-based approach. So we all know that in React.js there are components, and as we all say that everything is a component in React.js. So Facebook deployed React in its newsfeed in 2011, which improved its UI drastically. So before 2011, if I talk about, Facebook was not using React.js in its Facebook application. But after 2011, it started using React.js, and drastically the UI part or the performance part of the Facebook application got improved. And it's maintained by Facebook and Instagram. So Facebook and Instagram are the main applications nowadays. There are many other like Uber, which are using React.js in their applications. So specifically, if I talk about Facebook application as of now, the newsfeed part, the comment part, they are being developed in React.js precisely. Now, React job trends. If I talk about React job trends in India and job trend in USA, as you can see on the screen, that these are the various portals, I will say, in India, which provides the jobs. That these are the number of job posting for professionals on various job portals as on September 2017. Now, React job trends, if I talk about React job vacancy trend, as you can see, that means how much it has been increased with respect to React. If I talk about from 2014 to 15, 16 and 17, that how much the React reach has been increased among the developers or the React.js community. So let's get started. That was a just brief introduction about the React.js and how much it is famous. If you want to cross-check it or verify it, you can always see that since it's an open source library available, you can always see that how much it is famous on GitHub and other famous websites. You can very well check at any point of time. So let's get started with the interview questions. So this React interview questions webinar is divided into 4 parts or 4 sections. First, I will talk about the general React questions which are asked nowadays with respect to React.js. Then specifically to React.js, I'll talk about React components interview questions. Then we will talk about React Redux interview question related to React and Redux, that why it is required. And then lastly, we'll talk about React router interview questions. So let's get started with the general React questions. The first question, what is React and why it is required? What is React.js? So the answer for this particular question is that it's a front-end JavaScript library. So earlier we used to use in our applications jQuery and vanilla JavaScript in our applications. So I will say that it's a front-end JavaScript library which is developed by Facebook in 2011. Or it was adapted by Facebook in 2011, although it started as an open source project in 2009, but Facebook accepted it in 2011. And it follows a component-based approach. This is a very important point to understand, that React.js follows component-based approach. The other thing is that it allows to create reusable UI components. And why it is used to develop complex interactive web as well as mobile UI. It got open source in 2015, and then it has strong foundation and very large community base. If you go to GitHub and other communities, if you see or search for React.js communities, it has a very strong base and strong foundation with respect to React.js. Question number 2, what are the main features of React? The first is that it uses virtual DOM. As we saw in the previous webinars from Edureka, that what is the virtual DOM and what are the various features of React. So I'll just very precisely explain that what is virtual DOM, that it uses a concept of virtual DOM, which is separate from the real DOM. As compared to other client-side libraries which uses the general or the real DOM, the React.js uses a virtual DOM, and only the changes which are done from the application standpoint gets reflected, and then the virtual DOM takes care of each and everything. The other thing is it does server-side rendering, and the most important one is the follows unidirectional data flow, that is one-way data binding, which says all the data binding or the data flow happens in one direction only. The other question is that list some of the major advantages of React. What are the various advantages of React as compared to other libraries? If I talk about the advantages or the major use of React.js. So first one is it increases the application performance. Application performance will be highly optimized or highly increased if you are going to use React.js in your application. It can be used on client as well as server side. Readability is improved. It is very easy to integrate and easy to write UI test cases. This is very important that React.js is very easy to integrate with other libraries, for example, AngularJS, for example, Meteor. Since AngularJS is complete MVC framework and React.js is only a few part of the MVC framework, as we all know. But it is again very easy to integrate with other libraries and frameworks React.js. What are the limitations of React? So obviously there will be some limitations which are also there with React.js also. So it's not a full-scale framework. As I said that MVC standpoint, that is model view controller, React.js only handles the view part of it. So it's just the view. So library is quite large. Yes, I'll say that the React libraries, and also when it is get integrated with Redux, it becomes very large. So it's very difficult to understand for novice programmers. When I say novice programmers, so the programmers who are not having any knowledge of programming or OOPS concepts or the client-side libraries concepts, it will be very difficult for them to understand on a first go. And it uses inline templating and JSX. This is again very important point to know as a limitation of React.js, that all the styling part or the templating part from a JSX standpoint, that is a JavaScript extension, it is done inline. So there is no way of doing it externally or creating an external file in React.js. So these are some of the limitations, or I can say drawbacks of React.js. Now, what is JSX? JSX stands for JavaScript XML. It utilizes the expressiveness of JavaScript with the HTML-like template syntax. So in a nutshell, if I say JSX, it's a combination of HTML and JS. So which stands for JavaScript XML or JavaScript extensions. It's a combination of HTML and JS, JavaScript. And it also makes HTML very easy to understand. It is robust. It boosts up the performance of your application. And JSX expression must have only one outermost element. This is also again very important, that the outermost element in a JSX can only be one. So this is JSX in React.js. The other question is that what do you understand by virtual DOM? Explain its working. So as I said previously, that React.js uses a concept called virtual DOM, which is separate from the real DOM. So it's a lightweight JavaScript object, which is a copy of the real DOM. It works in 3 simple steps. How virtual DOM works, let's see. So whenever any underlying data changes, the entire UI is re-rendered in virtual DOM representation. Then the difference between the previous DOM representation and the new one is calculated. And once all the calculations are done, the real DOM will be updated with only the things that have actually changed. So which means that the real DOM and the changes which are done, only the differences between the previous DOM state which was there or a previous DOM representation will be calculated, or the changes will be calculated. And once all those calculations are done, the real DOM will be updated with the change part only. So you don't have to update every time the real DOM. Only the changes needs to be updated with only the things that have actually changed. So this is the concept of virtual DOM. Now differentiate between real DOM and virtual DOM. Again, a question is asked many times that what is the difference between real DOM and virtual DOM with respect to React.js. So as you can see on the screen, this is a table depicting the differences between the virtual DOM and real DOM. So if I talk about virtual DOM, it updates faster. For real DOM, it updates slower. It's very much obvious, as we saw that the concept of virtual DOM, that only changes are getting updated, not the complete application or the real DOM is getting updated, only the changes are updated. So obviously the virtual DOM will be pretty much faster as compared to real DOM. Now, second thing is that it can't directly update HTML. Real DOM can directly update the HTML. The other difference is that virtual DOM, it updates if JSX element renders. If elements updates, creates a new DOM. In virtual DOM, no DOM manipulation expense. As we all know that DOM manipulation expenses will be very less in virtual DOM, because we are talking about only the changes or the updates which has been done in virtual DOM. So the manipulation expenses will be very, very less. If I talk about the real DOM, on every change or update or click of the application in real DOM, DOM manipulation happens, which is very, very expensive. So in virtual DOM, I can say that there is no memory wastage. And in real DOM, there is too much memory wastage, because everything is remaining in your memory every time whenever you make any changes in real DOM. The other question is why browsers can't read JSX. This is a very important question. So JSX is not a regular JavaScript. As I said, JSX is not the JavaScript. JSX is a combination of HTML and JS file. So JSX is not a regular JavaScript. Browsers can read JavaScript objects only. They cannot read JSX kinds of things. So JSX file gets converted to JS object. There is a possibility how we can do it. So we have JSX transformers in place. Like for example, Babel, before reaching to browser, JSX needs to be converted with the help of a JSX transformer. So as you can see on the screen, if we have a JSX file, and if we want to show this JSX file on the browser, it cannot be rendered directly. You cannot render a JSX file directly on the browser in React.js. First, you have to transform it with the help of a JSX transformer. This is a JSX transformer. Then it gets converted to a JavaScript object. And as we all know that the browser only knows the JavaScript object, so this can be read on the browser then. So JSX file is converted to JS object by JSX transformer like Babel before reaching to the browser. This is the way how we can read a JSX file on the browser. Now, how React syntax changed from ES5 to ES6. This is something very interesting. I have given a separate webinar on ES5 to ES6 class refactoring. You can very well reach on another webinar from Edureka where I've explained with a demo that what changes have been done in ES5 class and ES6. ES5 and ES6, these are nothing but just like the versions, or I can say the standards of writing the code with respect to ECMAScript or JavaScript. So as you can see on the screen on the left hand side, there is the example of ES5 class, and on the right hand side, there is an example of the ES6 class. As you can see in the ES5, I am creating a component with the name where my component, and I am using react.create class. This is something very important. In ES5, we write this type of code or this type of syntax in React.js, react.create class, and we have a render function. This is mandatory. That render function needs to be there. How that converted to ES6, that we have a class keyword now, which extends react.component. This is the difference over here in ES5 and ES6. So please remember, in ES5, we used to have react.create class, and ES6, we are using a class keyword which extends react.component. This is a basic difference between ES5 to ES6 class refactoring. Let's move forward to other questions. How React is different from Angular? A very general questions and very common question I can say with respect to React.js and AngularJS, because these two are the most famous libraries or frameworks I can say out there in the market nowadays. So let's see what are the differences. We'll see the differences based on the topics. So in the middle of this table, you can say these are the topics on which we can differentiate between React.js and AngularJS. So if I talk about architecture, first of all, the architecture of these two libraries and frameworks. Angular is complete framework, I will say. It's based on the MVC model. You have model, view, and controller. So just like ng-app, ng-data, and you have to provide complete model, view, controller basics while creating an Angular application. In React.js, you handle only the view part. So if I cut out the model, if I cut out the controller, we are left with the view part, which is the basic functionality of a React.js. This is the most important difference. If I talk about the rendering part, it uses SSR kind of rendering, and AngularJS uses CSR kind of rendering. Now, if I talk about the DOM, virtual DOM is the only concept which is introduced with React.js. AngularJS still uses the real DOM kind of things. And we have already discussed the differences between the virtual DOM and the real DOM in previous slides. If I talk about the data binding also, we discussed that React.js follows one-way data binding or data flow. That is from parent to child, this is a one-way binding. But AngularJS follows two-way data binding, which is again sometimes very expensive, I'll say. If I talk about debugging differences, the debugging in React.js is done at compile time, and for AngularJS it is done at runtime. Now, if I talk about the authors, as we all know, React.js is introduced by Facebook and AngularJS is from Google. So these are the basic differences between AngularJS and React.js. So these were the questions related to React.js. I'll say these were the general questions or basic questions which are asked nowadays in any of the interviews if you are going to face based on the React.js. Now let's move forward and we'll talk about the second category or the second section of this webinar, which is React components. We'll talk about the interview questions which are asked on React components. Now the first question, what do you understand from in React everything is a component? As I said just before, that everything in React is considered as a component. The question asked is that what does it mean? Why we all say that everything in React is a component? So the answer is that components are the building blocks of React applications UI. Everything is a component, so these are the building blocks. They splits the UI into independent reusable pieces and renders each piece independently. That's why we say that in React everything is a component, because the main functionalities are done by the components. I will say that there are two types of components. One is the presentational components, or I can say the container components. The presentational components do the part of the view part or the presentation part of the application or your UI. And these container components, they help or they work as add-ons to the presentational components. And JavaScript functions, which takes in arbitrary inputs and returns XML representation. So we are taking the input as 1, 2, 5, and this how we are showing. If you want to show these boxes 1, 2, 3, 4 on our UI, that is how these are getting presented or rendered in the application. So components, these are the JavaScript functions which takes in arbitrary inputs, which are most of the time it's props, and they returns the HTML representation. Now explain the purpose of render in React. As we saw when I was talking about the differences between ES5 and ECX class, we saw the code snippet where we were using the render function. So what is the purpose of render function in React? This is again a very basic question. Let's see what is the answer to this. Every component must have a render. This is something very important to understand, that every component in React.js needs to have a render function. Without render function, you cannot run your React.js application. It will be given with an error that you cannot render the particular view part or the UI part which you are going to use. It returns the single React element, which is a representation of the native DOM component. Every render function always returns something. So what it returns is, it returns a React element, a single React element, which is a representation of the native DOM component. HTML elements inside render must be enclosed inside an enclosing tag. Again, very important point to understand, that HTML element inside render, they must be enclosed inside an enclosing tag. So there should be enclosing tag like div, group, form, etc. And there needs to be a pure function. So when I talk about a pure function, that render function needs to be a pure function. As we all know that there are two types of function, pure function and impure function. Impure functions are those functions which do not change the state or the logic of particular thing, and impure function, you can change the values of the variables as well. So that's why they are called the impure functions. This is very important, that how you can render or embed two components into one. So as you can see on the screen, I have two components. Let's say class my component extends react.component and class header extends react.component, which get embedded into one component, let's say my component. Now what are props? What is meant by props in React.js? So this is a short form for the properties, I will say. In React.js, instead of properties, we say props. Props are nothing but the properties for a particular HTML element. They are read-only, they are pure, which means they are immutable. We cannot change them, and always passed down from parent to child component. Why I'm saying this? Because as we all know, that React.js follows a unidirectional data flow or a unidirectional data binding. So that's why these props are always passed down from parent to child component, and they are used to render dynamic data. Yes, I'll say that this is pretty much very well said, that used to render the dynamic data. Now on the right hand side, if you can see the code, this class my component extends react.component. So first of all, this is a ES6 class type. We are using a render function, and in the return statement, what we are saying is we have a div. This is the opening div and this is the closing div. We are using h1. I have a function called header, which I am passing here the props. Now the header name equal to max and id equal to 101. So how I am going to use it in my function is, as you can see here, props.name. So name will come from here, name equal to max, and props.id. The id will get attached from here. So this I'm passing this as a props to the header function. And finally, when I say react.render my component document.getElement by id content, so the place where the content id or the class is there on my page, what is getting displayed is welcome max and id is 101. So this will be the output of this particular code snippet. So again, I just want to tell you one more time that react.render, as you can see over here on the screen, it is taking two parameters. The two parameters separated by comma. One is the component name, that is your root component also you can say. The other thing is document.getElement by id. This is the id of the placeholder or the ID of your HTML control which you are using to show the view or to show the UI on your screen. So document.getElement by ID. This is a JavaScript notation which we used to use in JavaScript, and we are passing the ID of our form control over here. The other question is, what is a state in React and how it is used? What is the use of state and how can we use state in React.js? So I'll say this is the heart of the React components. So all components, they interact with each other using state. State must be kept as simple as possible. It determines components rendering and behavior. State needs to be immutable. This is again very important to understand that the state needs to be immutable in React.js. It creates dynamic and interactive components. And as you can see in this code snippet, that state is accessed via this.state. So this is the this.state having two properties, name and ID. Name I'm passing at max and ID is 101. So this is the state, and this state is getting rendered over here. Hello, this.state.name. So it will say hello max and your ID is 101. And we can update the state also using this.setState. By using this.setState, we can update the state of the React components. Very important to understand, again, a very important interview question. I will say that what is the difference between state and props? As you can see in this table, there are various conditions on which I have distinguished or differentiate between state and props. The first one is receive initial value from parent component. Yes, I'll say that the state and props, they both receive initial values from the parent component, because as we all know that there is a unidirectional data flow or unidirectional data binding in React.js. So both state and prop, they receive initial value from their parent components. So parent component can change the value. With respect to state, we cannot change the parent component value, but for props, yes, we can do it. Set default values inside component. For both of them, we can set the default values. For state also, we can set it. As we saw that we set this.setState. So we set the values for a state, and we can also set the initial values or the default values for the props also. Changes inside component. For state, it is allowed. We can do the changes inside the component, but for props, we cannot do this. Set initial value for child components. Again, this is possible in both the cases, for state also and for props also. Changes inside child components. Now, there are two things here. As you can see on the fourth point, changes inside component. The sixth point says changes inside child components. So this is very important to understand. These two are the different things. That changes inside component can be done at the state level, but not at the props level. Whereas changes inside the child components can be done at the state level, but not at the props level. This needs to be kept in mind while dealing with state and props. The other question is, how can you update state of a component? Very simple question and very basic question. I'll say that how can you update state of a component, because every component is dealing with a state. There is a method called using this.setState. So using this.setState function, you can change the state of the component. So as you can see here on the right hand side, there is a code snippet. Again, I'm using the ES6 class standards. So as you can see here, this.state is having the name max and ID. In the render, this.setState, I'm changing the name as Jeha and ID is 2222. And when this is getting rendered on the screen, it will say hello Jeha and your ID is 222. So we can change the state or the initial state using this.setState function. What are arrows function, or what is arrow function and how it is used in React.js? So these are also called fat arrow functions. These are represented by equal to and greater than mark, as you can see here, that these are how they are represented in React.js. They are allows to bind the context of component properly, since auto binding is not available by default in ES6. This needs to be kept in mind, that allows to bind the context of the components properly, because auto binding is not available in ES6 system. So that's why we use arrow functions. It makes it easier to work with higher order functions. So if I'll talk about the general way of writing the code or with arrow functions, these are the differences. In the general way, you can see I'm using a render function. Here also I'm using a render function. But what I'm returning over here is my input on change equal to this dot handle change dot bind. But here I'm using a synthetic function, or synthetically what I'm doing is I'm passing variable e, and this dot handle on change I'm passing again as e. So that is how we can use the arrow function, by using this equal to and greater than sign. What are the differences between stateful and stateless components? This table is showing the differences. So stateful components are those which stores information about component state change in memory. Stateless are they calculate the internal state of the components. Stateful components, they have authority to change the state. As the name suggests, stateless components cannot have authority. They do not have authority to change the state. If I talk about stateful component, they contains the knowledge of past, current, and possible future changes in state. Stateless components, they contains no knowledge of past, current, and possible future state changes. Stateless components notifies them about the requirement of the state change. Then they send down the props to them. In a stateless component, if I talk about, they receive the props from the stateful components and treat them as callback functions. So this table is very important. It's a very general question again asked nowadays in React.js interviews, that what is the difference between stateful and stateless components. Now, what are the different phases of React component lifecycle? In a very interesting one. So as we all know that there are 4 phases. So here I'm depicting the 3 phases. And the initial phase, which are mostly used, the updating phase, one is the mounting phase, another one is the unmounting phase. We can amalgamate the 2 in one. So now it becomes 3. So initial phase, updating phase, and unmounting phase. As you can see on the screen, every phase is having their own methods, which are working in a particular order or this particular priorities. So initial phase is having the function as get default props, get initial state, component will mount, render, and component did mount. If I talk about updating phase, these are the methods or functions available in the updating phase. Again, it is at render. If I talk about the unmounting phase, so unmounting phase has a function called components will unmount. So these are the various lifecycle methods, I will say. These are called the lifecycle methods in React.js, which we need to have so that whatever props or components we are using, they get mounted and unmounted accordingly. Now, explain the lifecycle methods of React components in detail. If I talk about the lifecycle methods, which we just saw in the previous slide, that what are the lifecycle methods in React. So these are the various methods which we generally use. Component will mount. It gets executed just before the rendering both on client and server side. Component did mount. It is executed after first render only on the client side. The other one is component will receive props. It is invoked as soon as the props are received from parent class before another render is called. The other method or the lifecycle method is should component update. It returns true or false value based on certain conditions. If you want your component to update, return true, else return false. By default, its value is false. Component will update. It is called just before rendering takes place. Component did update, and the other one is component will unmount. This is called after the component is unmounted from the DOM. It is used to clear up the memory spaces. So all these are the lifecycle methods which are used in React.js. Now, what is an event in React? Events are triggered reactions, or I will say actions, to specific actions like mouse hover, mouse click, key press, etc. React events are similar to HTML JavaScript events. So for example, in this example or in this diagram, as you can see, this is a bulb. There is an action called switch on. If someone clicks on, the bulb is getting on. So this is kind of a event which is getting triggered, which are reactions to specific actions. How we can create events in React.js. So as you can see here, this is a render function. Class display extends react.component in a ES6 class standard of writing the code. Here I am using a render function which is returning a div, and on click is the event. That is how we can create the events in React.js. This.show click me. What are synthetic events in React.js? Synthetic events are the cross-browser wrappers around the browser's native event system. They combine the browser behavior into one API, and they are done to ensure events have consistent properties across different browsers. So if we want to have our React.js application running on different browsers, we will use synthetic events in React.js. Now, what do you understand by refs, which are references in React.js? So refs stands for references. So they are used to return references to a particular element or component returned by render. They are basically useful when we need DOM measurements or to add methods to the components. List some of the cases when you should use refs. So first of all, they are used to manage focus, text selection, or media playback. For triggering imperative animations, just like as you can see on the screen, if you want to display this kind of animation, imperative animation, we will use refs in React.js. And if you want to integrate with third-party DOM libraries, that is also where we use refs in React.js. How do you modularize code in React? So we can modularize code by using the export and import standards, or by using export and import properties. We can write the components separately in different files. So for one file, we will use the export property, and for another file, we can use the import property. That is how you can modularize the React.js code. And as you can see on the screen, the two code snippets for, or two files, I'll say, for export and import properties. How forms are created in React? This is again a very basic questions with interview question with respect to React.js. So HTML form elements maintain their own state in regular DOM and update themselves based on user input. However, in React.js, state is contained in the state property of the component, and it gets only updated via setState, as we all know. So JavaScript function is used for handling the form submission. What do you know about controlled and uncontrolled components? So as I mentioned earlier, components are of two types: presentational components and container components. Again, there are two other types of components which are controlled and uncontrolled. So controlled components are those which do not maintain their own state. The state is not maintained in control components. Data is controlled by parent component, not by the child components. The control components takes in current value through props and notifies changes via callbacks. If I talk about uncontrolled components, they maintain their own state. Data is controlled by DOM, and refs are used to get their current value. So if you want to use refs, we need to have uncontrolled components. Now, what are HOC? When I say HOC, these are high order components. So these are the custom components, I will say, which we developed while doing programming in React.js. So these are the custom components which wraps another component. They accept dynamically provided child components. Then they do not modify the input component. They do not copy any behavior from the input component, and I'll say that these are the pure functions. So basically, they are the custom components which are developed to add on functionality to some other components. These are called HOCs. So what can you do with HOC? HOC means high order components. You can reuse the code, logic, and bootstrap abstraction using HOCs. We can render hijacking, state abstraction, manipulations, and also we can also do state and props manipulations with HOC, high order components. Now, what are pure components? Pure components are the simplest, fastest components which we can write. These are very fast. They can replace any component that only has render. Enhances the simplicity and performance of the application. These are the pure components. As you can see here, there is a code snippet react dom.render h1 hello document.getElement by id content. So these are the two parameters which needs to be passed to the render function, and this is the simple component, I will say simplest component, or I can say the pure components which we can write in React.js, and hence the performance, and I will say it is the fastest in React.js. What is the significance of keys in React.js, or what is the significance of keys in React? It is used to identify unique virtual DOM elements with their corresponding data driving the UI. So as we all know, there is a key value pair combination always in every programming language. So just like that, we have keys in React.js, which is used to identify the virtual DOM elements. And what are the virtual DOM elements with respect to their driving UI? This we can know using keys in React.js. They must be unique number or a string. They helps React to optimize rendering by recycling existing DOM elements. So instead of re-rendering with keys, React just reorders the element. So if you don't want to re-render your UI, or if you don't want to re-render your components, you can just reorder the elements using keys in React.js. And obviously with all these things, the performance of the application gets optimized and highly increased in React.js. So that was all about the second section of the React interview question. Let's move forward, and now I will talk about the interview questions related to React Redux. This is a combination of React and Redux technology. So what were the major problems with MVC framework? MVC, we all know it's a model view controller. So what is the major problem? So DOM manipulation is very expensive because MVC framework is completely based on DOM and not on virtual DOM, just like in React.js. It's slow and inefficient, and there is a lot of memory wastage in MVC framework. Because of circular dependency, complicated model was created around models and views. So these are some of the drawbacks or problems with MVC framework. Now Flux. Before Redux, there was a technology called Flux, which was introduced by Facebook. So what was Flux? Architectural pattern that enforces unidirectional data flow. So there on the screen, as you can see, there is an action, then dispatcher, store, and view. So architectural pattern that enforces unidirectional data flow, controls derived data and enables communication between multiple components. Now, as you can see, there is a central store which has authority for all the data. Any update in data must occur here only. So store is the central or the heart for all React, Redux or Flux application. It provides stability to the application and it reduces runtime errors. What is Redux? Redux is one of the hottest library, I will say, for front-end development. It is very, very famous. You can also check how much it is famous and its popularity on GitHub sites, that it has more number of stars and more number of watches as compared to Flux. It's a predictable state container for JavaScript apps. It is mostly used for state management applications where state needs to be managed. Applications developed with Redux are easy to test, and it helps to write applications that behave consistently and can run in different environments. What are the three principles that Redux follows? First is the single source of truth, that is the store. Single source of truth, and when I say, I'm talking about here the single store. There is only one store in a Redux or a React Redux application. State is read-only in Redux. The changes are made with pure functions. You can make changes only with the pure functions in Redux libraries. What do you understand by single source of truth? When I say single source of truth, it is the store which I'm talking about in Redux application. Redux uses store for storing all the application state at one place. Whatever the state happening or state changes happening in a React Redux application, it will be notified to store or will happen in conjunction with a store. So components state is stored in the store and they receive updates from the store itself. So whatever the components, so these are the various components. So the state of all these components will be stored in a single place, which is called store. And any update needs to happen or needs to be there, that will be received from the store itself. The single state tree makes it easier because it's a single state tree, makes it easier to keep track of the changes over time and debug or inspect the application. What are the various components of Redux? First one is the action, which is an object that describes what happened. Reducer, it is a place to determine how the state will change. But I will say the reducers are the pure functions, which is how it needs to be done. As I said, action, that what needs to be done. Reducer, how it needs to be done is given by the reducers because these are the pure functions. Store, as we saw just now in the previous slide, that store, it's a single source of truth. There needs to be a single store which is used for state management of all the components. So a state object tree of the entire application is saved in the store. View is to simply displays the data provided by the store. Show how the data flows through Redux. Again, a very interesting question, that how we should know that how data is flowing through Redux. So as you can see here, that these are the container components, which is passing data as the props. They are passing the data to actions. Action is passing the data to reducer. So the input for the store is the reducer, and reducer is again giving the data to the provider component, or you can say the view part of it. So that is how the data flows in Redux applications. How actions are defined in Redux. Always remember that action should have a type property that indicates the type of action which needs to be performed. So type is very important for every action. So let's say in this code snippet, as you can see on the screen, there is a function called add_to, which is taking the input parameter as text. What it is returning is, it is a type, and this what type of action it is, add_to. So they must be defined as a string constant, and we can add more properties to it. That is not a problem with the action. You can add as many properties as you want, but the most mandatory part or the most important part for an action is it needs to have a type property, and actions are created using functions called action creators. The other question which we have is, what is the role of reducers? Reducers are the pure functions which specify how the application state changes in response to an action. It takes in the previous state and an action and returns the new state. So what is the work of a reducer? Basically, it takes the previous state, make the changes, and it returns the new state. It determines what sort of update needs to be done based on the type of action and returns the new values. It returns the previous state if no work needs to be done. If there are no changes in the state or if there are no updates, obviously it will return the previous state which it takes as an input, and as an output it returns a new state with the changed parameters. What is the significance of a store in Redux? Store, as we all know now, that store is the single source of truth. It's a JavaScript object. Holds the application state. It maintains the application, or I can say it maintains the state tree of the particular application. That is the store. Provides a helper methods to access the state, dispatch action, and register listeners. With store, the data state can be synchronized from the server level to the client layer without much hassle. And since it's a single store, it's a single source of truth, it's a single place to maintain the state tree of the application, it makes the development of the large application very easy and fast. How Redux is different from Flux. So these are the basic differences between Flux and Redux. If I talk about Flux, the store contains state and change logic. It has multiple stores, flat disconnected stores. In Flux, all the stores are disconnected. Singleton dispatcher, React component subscribe to the store. In Flux, state is mutable, so you can change the state in Flux. If I talk about Redux, store and change logic are separate. We have a single store in Redux. Single store with hierarchical reducers. You can have multiple reducers in Redux, but the store needs to be single in React Redux application. So if I talk about the container components, they utilize connect, and state is immutable. This is again very important, that the state is immutable in React Redux application. What are the advantages of Redux? So I've listed down some of the advantages of Redux: predictability, maintainability. The application will be very fast. It will be optimized. We have many developer tools. The testing and debugging part will be easy. And huge open source community for Redux is available out there on internet, and precise organization of code, because there is only one store which is maintaining the state, complete state of the application. So these are some of the advantages of Redux, which makes React Redux application very famous and very popular. Now moving to the last part or the last section of this webinar, that is the React Router interview questions. So what is React Router? It's a very powerful routing library, I'll say. It helps in adding new screens and flows to the application. It keeps the URL in sync with data that is being displayed on the web page, and it is a very simple API. The React Router APIs are very simple to use. Why switch keyword is used in React Router version 4? The switch keyword is used when you want to display only a single route to be rendered among several defined routes. So as you can see here, if I want to have multiple defined routes, but I want to display only a single route, then I use the switch statement. Why do we need a router in React? So router helps in defining multiple routes inside the router, with each route leading to a unique view. As you can see on the screen, there are multiple React routers. For example, these are the 3 routers, and each router is leading or representing, I will say, a unique view. So that is why we need a router in React. List down the advantages of React Router. So there are various advantages of React Router. The API is very simple, and the API is all about component. The API is component based. The router APIs, it can be visualized as a single root component. No need to manually set history value. It has separate packages for web and native platforms. That's why it's very famous. How React Router is different from conventional routing of data. So again, there is a table of the differences based on the various topics. Pages involved. Each view corresponds to a new file. In React Router, only single HTML page is involved. In conventional routing, we used to have multiple pages involved in application. If I talk about the URL changes, in conventional routing, HTTP request is sent to the server and corresponding HTML page is received. In React Router, only the history attribute is changed. This is a very drastic change in the request response terminologies. If I talk about the look and feel, user actually navigates across different pages for each view in conventional routing. But for React router, user is duped thinking he's navigating across different pages, but it is actually not the case. So that's all about the React interview questions. Thanks a lot. Thank you for watching this webinar.